Right, and we are live once again, second time for today. But man, am I excited for this conversation. Um, Gotta love when StreamYard does its delayed reaction thing. So like when people go back and watch this on YouTube, there's gonna be a nice like 3 to 4 second pause of just me being like into the camera.
Are we there yet? Are we there yet?
Are we live yet? It's obligatory. You got to do 10 seconds of are we live before you get to anything else. So there's a lot of conversation about the various points of the holiday season, and we've had a lot of that conversation here on the channel with different people in different ways. We've talked about, is this stuff pagan? We've talked about, what do Christians do with this whole idea of Christmas and all of that? How do we handle not alienating people that think about this thing differently, but still loving on them, but not negating where our hearts should be during the season. And there are a lot of individuals out there. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Go check out, if you want a very thorough look into holiday related, like is it pagan, is it not, all of that kind of stuff. Go check out Inspiring Philosophy's deal. He made a series of videos that are just that are
Amazing.
very thorough, very good. Yeah. And uncovers a lot of the misconceptions about the holiday. And so for me,
And it's
I'm
not
at this
just
point, right?
Christmas. He does every holiday. It's not just
He does.
Christmas. So when people start going after you about Easter and Halloween,
Mhm.
and he may even do 4th of July, I'm not 100% sure, but he's probably got a video if it's not there. So yeah, check out Inspiring Philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so for me, right, I'm in this spot where I've told my story, my story. I'm not growing up, like not living more of my life away from Jesus than with him, and not really liking Christmas even before becoming a Christian, which I think is its own misnomer that some Christians have about, the non-believers, like, oh, every non-believer loves Christmas and all of that kind of stuff. Like, oh no, plenty of people cannot stand Christmas. But the thing the thing that I carry into the holiday, right? And now this is a little bit more of a matured posture about it. Last year, I was incredibly obnoxious. Like it was like a kid the first time they were ever introduced to Santa and all of that. I don't know if we lost Andrew. There we
I'm
go. You moved. Okay. Um
I'm listening.
so I was obnoxious. I had the music, I had the whole thing. It was a whole thing. And but it was like the first time somebody turned it on. Somebody flipped the switch. And I was like, "Oh, well, wait a minute. This is what the Christmas spirit is. It wasn't the Christmas spirit. It was the joy of the Lord. And I shorthand that to say the spiritual gift of joy as a result of engaging with God, as the Bible promises us, right? Black text, white page. It's there. Look it up. Now, a year has passed, and I'm at this point of, okay, so what exactly now does it mean to carry the same mentality into the holiday that I carry for the rest of the year, right? I if you've heard me preach for 30 seconds, you understand where I'm coming from, right? I don't stop about the kingdom. I don't stop about the immersive everyday relationship. And because that's the difference maker. I can have the rest of it. I can have all of the rituals and the prayers and the liturgy and the songs and the word. I can have all of that. If I don't have that relationship with God, then all of that is null and void. It means nothing. It's just stuff. And one of the reasons why you were the first person, like if I was gonna have this conversation with anybody, you were the first person that came to my mind because, as we've talked about before, we've got a group chat with Brother Matthew. And in that, a couple of times it's come up that there's power behind allowing the story of the Bible to wash over you. That there's a time and a place to wax poetically and to study the word and all of those things. That's all got its time and its place, and it's all good stuff. Seriously, academic reps are not just for people with initials behind their name. Like it's good stuff because it fortifies everything that we're talking about here. It gives lines to color in, if you will. And we have access to this story of how the creator of everything has interacted with humanity, including the introduction of the kingdom through the cry of a child that we celebrate. So let's talk about that there's power in a time that's so crazy and so nuts and has so many stressors and has so many things. We were just talking about before we went on the air that this week is nuts for me. And this is a crazy period of time right now, both professionally and personally. And I feel like it's a responsibility to say, like, how do you keep saying you hold on to Jesus for dear life and you don't let go?
Yeah, it's weird because this always comes up around this time of year, no matter what the situation is. But then we also hear the exact same conversation happening throughout the rest of the year, but nobody recognizes that the same thing. They always assume that it's different. The stress that I have in June is completely different than the stress that I had in December, because in December it's all because we're just planning on the holidays, or it's because of the weather, or whatever. Yesterday it was 50 degrees here and I was in a sweatshirt, and now I'm freezing in my studio because it's -5. That's going to have some effect on my mood, those sort of things. But this idea of how do we actually, the way that I would word is, how do we actually show the idea of what Paul talks about not being anxious in anything, about having joy unspeakable, having this all peace, having the fruits of the Spirit. It comes up a lot around this time of year, but it's something that if we don't get it right the rest of the year, we're never going to get it right in December either.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating to me, or at least it was at first, that there were so many of the same conversations happening around Christmas that were happening around Halloween. That they are very similar in certain regards, with a lot of the conjecture back and forth. Is it pagan? Is it not? Whatever. But like you said, if this is something that isn't comprehended on, December 26th through the following December 24th, why should there be any level of expectation that this is something that'll be comprehended on December 25th?
Great.
Because spoilers, I've said this before, worst kept secret in Christianity, Jesus wasn't born on December 25th. And that's okay, because we still acknowledge that day as the day we choose to celebrate. And I'm speaking in terms of best case scenario, because I'm not foolish enough to say that this is every single Christian's perspective on Christmas. That's literally what we're talking about here.
Right. But
we choose to celebrate, again, the introduction of the kingdom through the cry of a child. And but the thing that gets me is there seems to be a disconnect between baby Jesus in the manger and the Jesus for the rest of the time.
Right.
I mean the entire life. I'm not
Right.
just saying let's not focus on the birth. Let's only focus on the death. No, the death, burial,
Well,
and
and even
resurrection obviously is an important part. But
even the pre-birth side of this always gets ignored. That's part
mm,
of why Brandon and I do the 12 Days of Misfits every year, is
right,
because we see this story throughout the entirety of the gospel,
right,
from Genesis all the way to Revelation. We see the story of why this actually matters.
hmm
And it's much more than just, oh, look, now God is here as a baby. And so, oh, good. Now, 3 months from now, when we can actually go outside again without it hurting, it's going, we can celebrate the death, burial, and resurrection. And, maybe in between there, we look at, the Gospel of John and all the works and things that Jesus does and everything else. But the reality is, the Christian church, the reason that Advent exists on our calendar
mhm,
is for a reason. There's supposed to be a preparation period before we even get to that, just like there's a preparation period before we get to the death, burial, and resurrection with Lent.
right,
Because the entirety of the Old Testament is people stressed out, anxious, depressed, waiting on the promise to be fulfilled that they're not 100% sure they're ever going to actually see with their own eyes.
right,
The story of Hanukkah is the fact that there was this 400-year period where the Jewish people were just on their own. They had no prophets. They just had to rely on what little faith that they still were carrying with them in the midst of oppression, and that little bit of
mhm,
faith was enough for God to do this great miraculous work.
right.
But for 400 years, it was like, okay, where is God? And
Yep,
that is really the attitude that we're talking about, as far as that we've got to get away from January through November
right,
before we can even talk about what December looks like. Because
yeah,
the stress and anxiety that you're feeling now in December is the same that you felt back in the summertime. And a
yeah,
lot of the time it is a matter of the fact that we just sometimes forget what we're celebrating in 2 days, and the idea that God is actually with us.
right, right. And that's the thing, that whole God with us. There's a lot of verses that people don't even realize they know. They've
Hmm.
seen it on if you've seen it on a if you've shopped the Christmas section of a Hallmark store, there are some verses that you
I
probably
try to
know.
avoid that at all costs. Just
Oh
saying.
yeah, I am sure. I am sure, but that's a funny mental image though, you in a Hallmark store. Um but even better mental image, Brother Matthew in a Hallmark store. Anyway,
I think we would literally have a bull in a china shop scenario at that point. Just
yeah,
saying.
yeah, yeah. So, but there are some verses that are out there that are so associated with Christmas, but have we stopped to consider what those verses are saying? Is that something that we've taken the moment to breathe, to let it breathe and consider what is being said? And moreover, like I am so sold on the story of the Bible that in and of itself, before you go any further, I think that's beautiful.
Hmm.
But then when you stop to consider who's saying it, the circumstances of what's going on, and all of that kind of stuff, like it 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 changes everything. And like I was saying with Ant this morning, I feel a little bit like I'm the guy that's nuts. That like there's a very small group of people here that get it. Where I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, what? Why are we not talking about this? Why are we so
Right.
busy talking about whether or not this is pagan? That's okay. The introduction of the kingdom through the cry of a child.
So, spoiler alert for those that are waiting for tomorrow's 12 Days of Misfits. But this passage right here is day
Yeah.
12, which is Isaiah 7, 10 through 25. And, the thing that is, Brandon, as I'm reading it to him, is reading, and he's like, okay, we hear this passage all the time at this time of year, and we see it. I don't remember if it's Matthew or Luke that quotes it, but we see it, probably Luke, concerning the what it's talking about.
Yeah, I'm
But
pretty sure it's Luke.
the context of "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given" is not some big happy, oh look, joy to the world. Or sorry, not for us to. That's Isaiah 9. Isaiah 7 is the idea of a virgin will conceive and have a child, and we will call him Emmanuel, God with us. And it's not some big joy to the world thing. It's the king of Judah is freaked out because he just saw the north get wiped out. He's worried that Assyria is coming for them. And Isaiah is like, oh, don't worry. God says, if you have faith, you will stand. And then Isaiah even tells it, and God is telling you to ask for the sign so that you can know that if you have faith, you will stand. And Ahaz goes, oh, I'm not doing that. I know better than to test God. And so God's reaction is, I just told you to have faith in what I'm telling you to do, and you can't even do it. So I will give you a sign, and the virgin will conceive. And because of this, the kingdom is actually going to collapse. And so the story of the virgin will conceive and have a child, in context of the entire story of Scripture, is not joy to the world. It's actually doom to Israel.
Yeah.
But we don't read that because we don't want to look at it that way, because we don't actually take time to appreciate what the story actually is, and that it's connected from the beginning to the end. We just want to have the few little verses that make us feel better about the time that we're in now, rather than recognizing how God has orchestrated everything to his glory.
Right. And that's the thing, like, when you look at the story and everything that happened, and yes, you can, there's the side B, or the next part of this is fortifying that with stuff like apologetics, stuff like history lessons, stuff like all of that stuff. Yes, there's a time and a place. Just because I'm not talking about it right this very second doesn't mean that I'm like trying to ignore it or anything like that. But the further I get in doing the academic reps, in doing all that kind of stuff, the more beautiful the story gets when I turn back to just accept the story. Because then I don't know, it's just like it's like a faith exercise, I guess. I don't know how else to say it. Like, I'm not sure that that's exactly what I mean, but it just,
it's a reset. It's not necessarily an exercise. It's more of a reset. That's what I've told, some of these big name apologetics people in some of these private groups we're in. They're talking about how, they're just feeling down. They can't get into the story anymore. Pastors that are getting ready to preach through Advent are like, we're doing the exact same thing we did last year.
right.
And the thing, my advice always is like, just read it. Just read it as if this is a story, and don't worry about any of the rest of it. Just read it as if it's a story. This is, and that's what, it's not my advice. This is the advice that Paul gives to Timothy. That's why we have 2 Timothy 3. 2 Timothy 3 is not just, oh, this is how we know that the Bible is trustworthy. Paul is telling Timothy, I'm about to die. You're about to go through some similar things. And if nothing else, based off of the letters we have about his church, you're going to go through some things because of the people in your church. And he tells, like, the stories. The
Yep.
stories that your grandmother told you, the stories that your mother told you. Just hold on to the stories for a little bit. You don't have to go in and dive deep. You don't have to, just hold on to the stories because they are beneficial for us.
Yep.
The theology is important, and it comes out of those stories.
Yep.
Why do we believe that man is made in the image of God? It's because we know the story of the fact that God takes time out to create man in his image, when everything else he just says, okay, this is going here, this is going here, this is going here.
Right.
We know that because of the story, not because we've sat there and dissected and dissected and dissected every single syllable of every single word.
Right. And to hit the fast forward button, everything that Andrew just said is why we know today that we are called to love first, not hold back, all of those kinds of things, because God took the time out to create man in his own image. And then we can track the story from there. That brings us to the point of what this looks like now as indwelt creatures, as sons and daughters, and all of that. Like, to me, the further I go, the more interconnected it all is, the more beautiful it all is, and I mean in its full context. I want the full thing. I want the story, not let me grab this and let me shop here and let me do that, because that sort of thing, like, dude, that cheapens it. And I'm not just saying as an academic purist. I'm saying as somebody who knows the story. If you take out part of the story, then you have changed the story and made it into something different. And when you do that, and when you start to segment it, and I'm going to grab this and this and this, you are degrading the story. And that's one of the most whimsical things, right? So one of my big things every year, the tradition is to give a sermon based around a movie. And one of the things that it's part of it, guys, is a rib. I understand generic megachurch pastor number 5 sermon. So does everybody and their mother. That's the gimmick. I don't. So that's that's the joke. And so this year was the Santa Claus, and that there's a line in the Santa Claus where kids don't need to see in order to believe. I think as adults, we have gotten the belief kicked out of us, the wonder kicked out of us, the fact that we can't just stop and say, wait a minute, hold the phone. The creator of everything created man, saw that man screwed the pooch, and then decided to make, like, and did still extended the branch to us in the form of the Savior, like, and then going on from there to the everyday, to the immersive, to the fact that I don't have to go through somebody else, or I don't have to make guessing games, or I don't have to do a bunch of rituals in order to be able to come into the presence of God. I don't need to do any of that.
We talked about this the first time that Dr. Beth Allison Barr was on Misfits. And we were talking to Dr. Barr as a historian, not as an author. We were asking her why history matters.
Right.
Why does history actually matter? Church history, biblical history, world history, American history. Why do we care? And one of the things that was kind of interesting with the way that we were talking through it was she was saying the same sort of thing that I had just said a minute ago. Of if we just read the Bible as a story, that's a way to reset our faith a little bit, of just regaining that initial, like, this is why we got into this in the first place.
Right.
But the other side of it sometimes is that when we actually read the academics behind it, when we read the history of the story and still are treating it as a story, the academics sometimes can actually make the story even more amazing and wonderful
Yes.
when
Yes.
we remember again that this is a full story, not just an individual doctrinal thing. She shares the story of I can't remember who it was, famous Christian that's now an atheist. She knows
Take your pick.
yeah, she was talking to his professor, and he said that he had no idea that the academic stuff he was teaching,
Mhm.
what it was doing to him,
Mm.
because it was taking the story out, and now it's just another historical text that we're having to fact check,
Yeah.
and it completely destroyed everything. Whereas sometimes the idea of we're reading Genesis 1 and 2, and we understand that this is a Jewish poem,
Mhm.
not a science textbook. The story just becomes even greater, seeing the fact that in the way that God created the world,
Mhm.
there was order
Yeah.
and there was intentionality behind it. And yeah, the science actually does line up, but not because this is a science textbook, but because our God is a God of order
Right.
and our God does things intentionally.
Yep.
It changes the mindset completely, and it allows us to experience the story for ourselves rather than just another we sat in Sunday school and this is what was relayed to us.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the further the more time that I spend in the scriptures, the more I've come to appreciate the parts of Paul's writings where he is trying to convey the marriage behind the academic and I guess the matters of faith, the joyous parts. I
Mhm.
think sometimes we categorize Paul as purely just an academic. And yes, a lot of his stuff that we have is academic in nature and all of that. But if you're tracking and not just reading from highlight to highlight and really like walking through the scriptures slowly at a pace where you are essentially walking with the characters, you find that there are moments where Paul's like, it's not about the academic lesson. It's about taking God at his word.
Mhm.
And when we do that, when we take God at his word, like that's all of the thing that baffles me is the people that don't get what I just said tend to look at me and say things like, what about theology, or
Mhm.
what are you just trying to get rid of that, and all of that kind of stuff, like, or for the people that really do not understand where I'm coming from, I hear words like hyper grace and all
Yeah.
of that kind of stuff. Now,
Which the funniest thing is that when we talk about those things like
mhm,
hyper grace doesn't care about the story.
mm-mm,
Hyper grace doesn't need
no,
the story.
nope,
Hyper grace is able to just take and pick what it wants.
yeah,
The anti-academic, anti-theology doesn't want the story either, because the story is going to require them to do the theological work.
right,
You're going through Matthew right now with Buddy Walk. He spends like the first almost 8 chapters trying to retrain the brains of at least his followers to actually do the theological work of all this stuff that they have always been taught.
yeah,
That's the entire Sermon on the Mount is, you have heard it said this, but I'm telling you that what that actually means is this.
yeah,
It's not a matter of it is this. Daniel has you guys have read Daniel and you're waiting for this, but I'm
mhm,
telling you that this is actually what Daniel saw.
yeah,
Abraham had been, longing for the promise, and we say that we are his promise, but the reality is he looked ahead and saw me. Granted, this is
yeah,
John, not Matthew, but You know, the whole thing of when we actually are going to read the Bible, we have to read it in a way that allows us to actually understand this stuff. The whole
Yeah.
point of this book is for us to be able to understand who God is and why he would actually make us in his image and why it matters what we do and how we react to him. That's what theology is. It doesn't mean we have to do the academic side of theories and, 18,000 word papers and everything else.
Yeah.
But we have to at least begin to understand who God is. And we should want to. I mean, that should be what we're wanting to do if we are saying that we are Christians and wanting to become Christ-like. That means we should probably want to actually understand what that looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not wholly a human thing. So the thing to consider in all of this is, yes, there is a matter of choice involved in all of this. I can choose to, after today, I can go off and I can just listen to podcasts or watch things on YouTube or do different things like that and not spend any time in the scriptures. I'm saying any time that I could be ingesting, I choose to stay out of the scriptures. That is my choice. And a lot of what we're talking about is kind of hanging out at that point of choosing to immerse yourself in the story. The added salt to that is that as we desire to explore these theological things, again, like Andrew said, it's not a matter of the word theology and the word academic are not interchangeable. They're not the same thing.
Right.
A lot of people think they are, but they're not the same thing. And that desire to know more, that desire to grow in that relationship, that desire to walk further and deeper and spend more time and all of that kind of stuff. I also think for people that have never experienced that sounds like that's a person choosing to, I go to point A, oh, I want to know more. Let me go to point B. Oh, I want to know more. Let me go to point C, and so on and so forth. Follow me here, because every time, every step of the way, there is some version, some form of I am choosing to answer the tugging of my heart. I'm choosing to answer the wooing of my spirit to these deeper things. But that prompting, that initialization part, that friends is supernatural. And understanding and resting in that spirit, that is when the human truly comes alive. It's not about the I'm killing it, so great. Like I'm it's all success, so it's so good. And that's where the times where this life is truly technicolor are when we are engaged with God. And that doesn't just mean sitting in your prayer room. That doesn't just mean time in the scriptures. Guys, understand, we live in the playground. We live in the immersive experience that we get to live this thing out. That is okay, and in fact encouraged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I'm trying to remember where I was going after you said that. Oh, it's starting to come back.
Okay.
You can keep talking though, because it may take a minute. It's cold up here, so things are going a little slower than normal.
That's funny. But yeah, I mean, so part of that is where I think some of the finer points of the season have a way of getting lost when we make it about particulars and we make it about certain aspects or different things like that. Like, one of the things that I've noticed is a lot of times churches will celebrate specifically the birth of the Savior, right? The birth of Christ. Okay, cool. Aces. Fine, as long as you're not taking liberties and we're walking through the biblical account, aces. I don't have a problem in the world. But let's make sure that as those things are Brother Matthew in the comments, it's Saint Joe and Drew the Elf. Yeah. I want you to understand that from here on out, you are now Drew the Elf. Uh
Great.
yeah. When we understand that it all works together, that it's all when we dive into the story and we look at the academic, and when we all of the things are all coming together, that is the thing that pushes forward the existence of us being fully fledged citizens of the kingdom of God. And embracing that whole totality is along the same lines as when you guys hear me say that you can talk about the gospel without once saying death, burial, or resurrection. Oh, dude, the first time that I said that, I legit had people breaking down my door in my inbox. Like, that was not okay. But you can talk about the gospel without saying death, burial, resurrection. It's that same exact concept when we talk about what living in this reality during this time means.
Kind of going off of that, and then also I remembered what it was that my brain completely shorted out on before that. This idea of we have to use specific words in order for the gospel to be preached.
Yeah.
Is very similar to what, we started this whole thing off of, this idea of people that, the stresses, the anxieties of Christmas, that in reality are the exact same ones you had 2 months ago, and you just now are blaming whatever you're blaming it on. It really does go back again to this idea of why we are talking about actually embracing and immersing ourselves in the story of everything.
Yeah.
Is that, Jesus had been prophesied since Genesis 3.
Mm-hmm.
We knew he was coming. We knew what he was coming to do. We knew the city, or the area in which he was going to be born. We have a time period even through Daniel of when it's happening. We know all this stuff. But yet the people did not recognize him because he did not look like what they were expecting. He did not meet their expectations. And it's the same thing that we've got going on at the moment with all of these other things. Is people have misunderstood the idea of what joy is. They've misunderstood the idea of what peace is, what love is. They've misunderstood what the point of the gospel is. The gospel is not about getting out of hell. The gospel is not about getting into heaven.
Right.
The gospel is about the story that has been finished at the cross and that is continued post-cross. Jesus says it is finished because that part of the story is done.
Mm-hmm.
But then it continues on. And when we fully understand what these sort of things look like,
mm-hmm.
and get rid of the expectations of what we think they should look like,
mm-hmm.
it allows us to actually experience this stuff as it, we're able to actually just dive in and enjoy it for what it is.
Right.
We're able to let it actually speak to us and encourage us in the times that we need it to encourage us. We can allow it to humble us when we need it to humble us.
Right.
You know, we can allow it to teach us these deep theological thoughts when we are ready to take them in. We don't have to force anything because, again, God is intentional. That's part of the whole story, is God is intentional. So why do we now assume that we have to take all of these different things and put them into our personal stories when we're not ready for them? And that includes even this idea of, why we think that the gospel is only just death, buried, rose again. That's not even what we find in the gospels. That's what we find in 1 Corinthians 15.
Right.
What we find in the gospels is born, lived, ministry, sacrifice, comfort.
Yep.
I didn't use a single one of the words that everybody thinks has to be used, but yet nobody's going to be able to say that I missed a single piece of the gospel stories with that.
Right.
You can't quote 1 Corinthians 15 without saying death, buried, resurrected, which is why it's part of our creeds. That's why it's important. But again, it's part of the whole story, not the only story.
Yes. 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 And one of the unfortunate realities that I've seen is that there are a fair number of people that at a basic and fundamental level, and I'm not calling anybody out, I'm not saying anybody in particular, because I've seen this happen in
Everywhere.
variety of forms, variety of sizes, that these fundamental things are lost, and so that way the rest of it doesn't really register, because you're talking about base level right now. This is not theology 405. This is not high end whatever. This is living your relationship. This is reading and understanding what it means to engage with the text and engage with God. And it's funny, last year I had this moment where I reached out to the guy that raised me up in the faith, and I was like, with everything going on, I was in a bad mental space going into November, and it was a whole thing. I'm like, with everything going on, I explained to him what I was doing. I was, the everyday walks and being purposeful about only listening to the Bible during that time, like no podcast, no nothing else, just taking in the scriptures, but engaging with them, not just background noise and all of that. And I explained all of that to him, and I'm like, okay, so am I just putting 2 and 2 together and trying to get 6 by listening to this and all of this kind of stuff? And I feel like joy. It's not happiness, but like it's something deeper than that. And he's like, nah, friend, it sounds like you have been given a gift.
Mm-hmm.
And a year later, it's not the same exact situation, but there's tons of reasons to be salty. Not a jury in the world would convict about me being salty. But I still know that in the midst of all of the hubbub, at this moment in time during the year, we celebrate. And why? And that serves as almost a checkpoint. I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
where like
it's a checkpoint. I mean, that really is what Dr. Linville talked with us, almost a year ago now, when we were going through the We were talking ecclesiology and everything on Misfits as we were getting through the church history stuff. And, one of the things that he has said that I have always kind of latched onto is this idea of, when we talk about the Eucharist, something that has been handed to us in the story, and even in that story or in the Eucharist, we're supposed to tell the story because again,
Right.
it's about the story. But part of what he talks is, it doesn't really, Scripture doesn't say how many times to do it. It doesn't say when to do it. It doesn't, but it says to do it. And we do it because they are spiritual checkpoints for us. Same thing with baptism. Baptism is a spiritual checkpoint.
Yeah.
Baptism is a, once or twice, depending on, how you want to do it, checkpoint of, okay, do I actually believe what I claim to believe? Am I going to publicly stand up here and say that I believe this now?
Right.
The Eucharist then is a weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly, whatever it is, checkpoint of, is my heart right with my brother?
Right.
And are we actually in a place where we should actually be worshiping and celebrating in this story?
Yeah.
And that's part of what I think what you're talking about here as far as why it's so important to just dive in every once in a while almost as if you're just reading a good book, not just a, spiritual guide, but an actual book with a story that has a beginning and an ending, is because of the fact it is a checkpoint of, oh yeah, this is why I got into this in the first place. This is why I was able to get through such and such a time. That's one of the things where, and as you do it, Misfits, again, 3 tiers, we're always going into that stuff. But this is why when we talk theology, we are very specific about, this is Christocentric theology. It is Christ-centered. It brings focus in on that. We only get that if we are reading this as a story about Christ. Yes. It is Christ-centered the whole time. And when we do that, it allows us to actually be able to just go ahead and just read the story and just think on the story for a while and be able to find our way again and reset and checkpoint, because it's drawing us back to where our focus is supposed to be in the first place. Now, this is how we're able to read, one of my favorites is, Elisha and the bears. If you don't know what that is, Elisha is an old prophet who's bald. A bunch of probably older teens are out there making fun of him because he's bald. Elijah just says a soft little prayer, walks away, and then bears come out of the woods and maul these kids.
Yeah.
And you read that and it's like, where do you see Christ in the midst of all of this? Well, the reality is that you don't mess with somebody that has been anointed by God, that has been called according to his purpose.
Yep.
It's Christocentric. It reminds us of who we are actually working for when we do these things. Jonah and the whale, as we go through, where do we see Christ in the midst of all this? Jesus goes back and says, you'll receive, you will see the sign of Jonah before I leave. Because it was an important piece, because it showed the idea of the fact that you thought he was dead, and yet God brought him back.
Yep.
You don't even have to look at the compassion, the mercy, the forgiveness, shout out Phil Vischer in the, Jonah VeggieTales movie. You don't even have to go into those layers to be able to see how the story centers us back on who Christ is and why he came and what he's doing. And that is the checkpoint that we've got to have regularly, personally and corporately, of a remembrance of the fact that Christ is the one that is at the center of all of this, not us.
Right. And one of the things that stood out to me this year, to go back to the whole Hallmark thing, right? You've heard this a million times, even if you don't know what it is, or where it's located. And it's kind of funny that you started quoting it accidentally, but it's Isaiah 9:6. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
read it off. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Now, we discussed before the setting of the stage to
All of it.
to all of this. But then included in all of that is this idea that it's already being set that he's being identified as Prince of Peace. And then you go you go forward to verses like 26:3, that again, you will keep in perfect peace
Mm-hmm.
those whose minds are steadfast on you. And good.
I was gonna say, this is where, again, we talked about this before when I misquoted it. Of this idea, the fact that, we hear these verses all the time and we just like, yeah, we hear these verses all the time at this time of year.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't look at what it's actually saying in context.
Yeah.
And, this is something where the names of Jesus, the names that we have here, it's not just, oh, we know what he's going to be.
Yeah.
We've got the Trinity right here.
Yeah.
We know who he's going to be. This is Yahweh that is coming down.
Yeah.
This is shameless plug for the blog we just released over on Misfits. Is this idea, within this chapter, in verse 4, it talks about the fact that he's going to come and break the yoke of oppression and the rod on our back, on our shoulders. And then in verse 6, all of a sudden now the government is on this guy's shoulders. Mm-hmm. And we don't talk about that at Christmas time because we only care about the little bit of the prophecy of, for unto us a child is born, and now we have his names. Yeah. And even when we go and look through the commentaries, we don't see anything but the Christmas stuff. Mm-hmm. We're completely ignoring an entire section of not just the Bible, but of world history. This is a big deal within world history. This sets up Nebuchadnezzar. Right. Like we don't have Nebuchadnezzar, we don't have Alexander the Great, we don't have Rome without this verse.
Right.
But we don't look at it because we're so focused on what we want Christmas to look like, right, that we miss the whole story behind it. Yep. And the way that we can get back is if we just read this passage as this is another prophecy, and yeah, we know how it's fulfilled. But there's so much more involved because, again, God is so intentional with everything he does. Right. There's so much more that we're able to grasp, not only about the world that we're living in now, but about who God is himself. Like the fact that he promises the Father, Son, and Spirit there in Isaiah 9, even though everybody tells you that the Trinity doesn't exist within Scripture. We've got all three parts in one verse, all tied to the birth of this baby. Right. But when we don't read it as a story, we miss the whole thing.
Yeah. And reading it as a story, taking in the full thing, we then have the ability to be able to rest in that, mm-hmm, and to be able to accept the realities of what this is saying. Yes, there's a lot of world history. Yes, there's a lot of things going on within this prophecy. And when you take all of that in its full context, then it's not just a concept. Then it's not just an idea that's something that you can, help you be less anxious or whatever like that. No, we have something very concrete that we can rest in, mm-hmm, that we are promised will be a source of joy and peace in our lives.
And
That's
even,
not specific. Good.
I was gonna say, and even beyond just the history and all that stuff, because again, you're gonna get the people that are saying, "Well, we don't want the academic stuff." And even though this is just basic, like this is how we got here. If you don't like that stuff, that's fine, because even from a personal perspective, we've got to have this sort of mindset when we read what we're reading. You know, when people talk about the story of Job, the story of Job is always relayed as, oh, well, see, God is testing people because of their faith, and so everything works out in the end. And, oh, look, Job is so great and all this other things, and now we're going to all compare ourselves to Job anytime something bad happens. But in doing so, they actually miss the story of Job, which is that it's not about Job at all. Even though God names him and chooses him, it's not about Job at all. It's all about God still. And the fun thing is that when we read it as a story, we can see that Job actually gets this in the first chapter.
Right.
You know, and this was something that I had never seen until I had to personally experience it when we lost Carson.
No.
Is this the verse that is always, you hear all the time, is this idea of the Lord gives, the Lord takes, or naked I come, naked I lead, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord.
Right.
And then you hear all these sermons about, see, the Lord will give and the Lord will take away, and so we just have to be content in everything. And that's the message that we hear. And then they throw in Paul in Philippians with, see, this is why we need to just be content with what we have, which is a good message. But that's not the message of this story. Because the message of this story is, blessed be the name of Yahweh. It doesn't matter what my situation is, God's name is still blessed. Because God is God and I am not. And that completely changes the entire way we read the rest of Job. Of course, Job is getting annoyed with his friends, saying, well, have you actually considered maybe you're the problem here? It's not about Job at all. It's not about him. It doesn't matter if he had sin or not. God is still blessing. God's doing what he's doing. Job is just along for the ride.
Right.
It completely shifts our mind away from what the situation is we have right now back to Christ at the center. This is what Paul talks about in Hebrews 12 as far as the running the race and keeping our eyes focused on the end line. And the guy at the end line is Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Because if it begins and it ends with Jesus, we're going to actually be able to run the race that God set out. Right. But when we start looking at things from our story perspective rather than his story perspective, it's very easy to get pulled off course.
Yes. And that's the beauty in all of this. That's why I even make the connection between like the beauty of believing in the beauty of just immersing yourself and all of that is because we can focus on Christ. We can meet, like we seek after God, we will meet him. Mm-hmm. God does not hold back from us. I can't stop complicated, and I'm sorry for that. I can't stop the complicated stuff from happening. Nonsense happens on a regular basis, whether it's Christmas or not. Like Ant says, time and chance happen to everybody. And that does not invalidate the peace and joy of the Lord. That's circumstances of the world, and we can look beyond that to the joy and peace that we have with God. And that understanding all of that, again, it's not about the academia of it all. It's about understanding taking in the whole story of it all. That a series of events happened, and then Jesus, and everything changed. And that in the midst of a season that so desperately wants to rob us of any sense of peace, any sense of joy, any sense of security. Because I know, man, I know that there's going to be somebody out there who is upset because they can't give their kids a proper Christmas, or they're going to go into a boatload of debt. Or I know people that are mourning losses from throughout the year, and this is the first Christmas that they won't have somebody. And it's there's so many things. And what we're saying here does not seek to invalidate any of that. We're not trying to invalidate where you're at or what you've been through. This is to say, okay, in the midst of a complicated world, in the midst of a very broken world, we have the thing that you can put your trust into, that you can put your belief into. That is something that has us and holds us. But the reality is you don't get there without the story.
Mm-hmm.
But I promise you that the story, while compelling in all of these things, contained within there are spiritual realities that are far beyond whatever words I can put to them.
Yeah, I would even add that the story validates the joy and the peace in this season.
Yeah.
Because it shifts our perspective away from the what I'm feeling now to understanding what these things actually are.
Right.
Joy to the world is because the Lord has come, not because it's Christmas time.
And those are different for anybody who doesn't realize that. Those are two different things.
Right. That's what we talked about this on, or a group of us were talking about this on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, of the fact that, people don't realize the fact that a lot of these Christmas carols that they sing were ones that were not necessarily just like, oh, we're celebrating the season. These carols were songs of protest. "O Come, not O Come, Come, O Come All Ye Faithful" was an abolitionist protest song against slavery. It's not about, oh, look, we're all here together and, all these things and the lights and yay, Jesus is here. It's in his hand, in his hands all oppression will cease. The story that we are reading is that Jesus is coming to defeat death and set everything back to the way that it was supposed to be before we screwed up his work.
Yeah.
That is what the story actually is.
Right.
It's not just, oh, Silent Night, everybody's all, peace and quiet.
Right.
A teenage girl just had a baby in the middle of chaos. In an ancient time period. Pretty safe to say it was not silent and lowly. That.
Yeah.
But we don't want to think that. Because that takes away from the Christmas time vibe that we think we're supposed to have. Because we're celebrating the birth of a king. But we're celebrating the birth of the king who came down as the lowest of the low. In order that he might be able to empathize with us as he takes all of our sin on the cross.
Yep.
That's the story that we have. And that's the story that we need to actually remember, and we can only get that when we actually read the story rather than just pop in Charlie Brown at this time of year and let Linus tell us how it is.
Look, man,
Linus is,
just because
I
I
mean,
dug that last year, just
I will say that, but I mean, even with that though, is that if we actually look at Linus is just reading the story.
yeah,
He's experiencing the story. All he's wanting to do is just experience the story, but nobody will let him because that's not what Christmas is supposed to look like.
right,
And we will
right,
say all we want in evangelicalism that, oh, we hate the commercialization of Christmas. But the reality is that we're doing the same thing because we are not just letting the story sit with us during this time.
right, right. And that's what I'm getting at when I say we have to separate ourselves from the images of Christmas, that it has to look like a silent starry night in a manger, like these kind, like, yes, there are biblical aspects of the account, but there are also regurgitated Christmas card images that make it seem like something that really was not. But when we stop trying to make it look like a Hallmark card, when we stop trying to make it look like something very specific, and we just let the story speak for itself, we're talking about the most beautiful event that's ever happened in human existence. We are talking about a kept promise, old, generations old.
As old as the earth. I mean, it goes back to Genesis 3.
Right.
The thing that, this threw Brandon off also was we read, I think it's Micah. We read out of Micah 5 and the verse of out of Egypt I called my son.
Yeah.
And that, it's like he could not, he was struggling to connect where that he knew that was part of the story somehow, but he couldn't connect it because we think of the wise men within the nativity story as far as, oh, look, they came and presented gifts to the child. Whether people have it correct in that they were not at the manger, or they want to throw it in with the manger. Either one, they just want to look at that as like, look, these foreign powers came and gave gifts to the king of the Jews.
Right.
But we forget about the fact that event triggered a genocide.
Yep.
Genocide is part of the Christmas story.
Yes.
And it has to be. That was part of the prophecy. That is how we get Joseph and Mary out of Bethlehem and into Nazareth.
Yep.
But we don't ever want to talk about that because why do we want to include genocide in our Christmas carols?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, when you have something that is that there are that many prophecies, there are that many pieces that have been given along the way, then you have to accept the fact that a series and chain of events had to take place, and you take the full thing into consideration. But again, even still, yes, there's all the series of events, but still, like, it is still a story that ultimately leads to Jesus, and something that we don't need in the present. Yes, there's time for the academics of it all, but you need that in order to be able to rest in the truth of the Messiah. And yes, there's all of these other complicated things in there too, but while they're complicated, they're necessary. And while they're necessary because ultimately we know this is the fulfillment of the promise.
And you'll find that those difficult things when you're reading this, and the idea of we're just resting in the story, is that if it's messing with you so much that you've got to somehow bring these things to terms, you'll be able to find it pretty easily within the academics. Because if it's going to mess with you this much, it's going to be something you want to actually try to understand.
Yeah.
And so you'll be able to figure out a way to understand it. Sometimes you're going to run into these things that are conflicting and crazy and they make your head hurt. And you're going to be okay, though, when you're resting in the story of saying, it's like, I have no idea what he's saying here, but you know what? I can see how it fits in the story, so we're just going to keep reading through the story and see if it resolves itself in the end.
Exactly.
You know, it's the difference between the people that have to go and read movie reviews while they're watching and the people that are just okay actually watching to see if they can figure it out at the end. You know, it's two
Yep.
different kinds of people that we're dealing with in that sort of setting, but it's the same thing of, are we going to let the story just see if it works itself out and then we ask questions later? Or, okay, this doesn't make sense. Do we need to go dive in and figure out why this doesn't make sense before we even continue on? And both of those things are going to be okay as long as your focus is still on Christ at the center of the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because if Christ is at the center of the story, your theology is going to be centered back on him. And so even if you come out at the end saying, I have no idea what this said, but I see how the story fits together, you're going to be able to be back you're going to be before the cross again.
Yep.
You know,
Yeah.
that was one of the things, 1 Timothy 3, the mystery of godliness is great. We do not understand God, and we can't understand God fully this side of heaven. And I mean, I would maybe even make the argument we probably still won't fully understand in heaven either. But it will be okay that we don't understand. Because again, Christ is the center of the story, not us.
Exactly. Exactly. And not some interpretation, not some picture, but Christ at the center. And that looks a very particular, like that has its own context, and it has its own setting and all of that kind of stuff that you can find in the scriptures. And as you explore that, this is a day over day sort of thing. This is not special times, prayer closet twice a year, none of that. This is walking in the realities of the scripture and understanding the story, understanding the context, to understand that at the present age, in this present moment, this is what brought me here. This is what has led to this moment where I can say, you know what? Life's complicated. You know what? Yeah, they still keep sending those gimmicks every month. There's still issues with cars to be had. There's still health issues. There's still all of the things. But in the midst of all of that, I can focus on the King and have a relationship that isn't just abstract, like I'm focusing, like meditating or something like that. Like, no, we are indwelt. We are indwelt creatures. And that, again, that is something that sees us through the complicated, not invalidates or negates or anything like that.
And it's something where, again, going back to Isaiah 7, of understanding how this fits in the story, is the fact that if we understand that part of the story, of the fact that this is Yahweh here with us, then we can understand that in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the complicated, as all these gimmicks are coming in and all the car problems and the health problems and global pandemics and unemployment and everything else, God is here with us.
Yeah.
And we know that God is the same today, yesterday, today, and forever.
Yes.
And so there is something that we can hold on to that is constant, and that is this story. Even when in the story things seem chaotic. There's a foreign power over us. We're about to be thrown into a furnace. There's a giant whale coming to eat us. All of these different things that we see in Scripture where it was chaotic. David's on the run after he's been crowned or been anointed as king. God does not change.
Exactly.
And when Christ is at the center, our hope doesn't change either.
Right. Exactly. All right. So with that, I say to everybody, Merry Christmas. Um, I know a lot. I know a lot was said, and regardless of if you've had pretty standard traditions and you think of things in a very specific way, or if you're wondering how to immerse yourself in this, I say go in peace. Understand that this isn't about taking aim. This is about celebrating the realities of this thing. And I just encourage you guys, rest in the realities of the story of the scriptures. So until next time, be safe. We'll catch you soon. Peace.